Hi viewers and welcome back to CEC-UGC. I welcome you all. It is good to see you all once again to another lecture, this time on the much celebrated, the much popular and I would say the novelist that each one of us has heard about, that is K Narayan, perhaps the most popular novelist of the 20th century in India. Thank you all for tuning in with me again. My name is Piyush Chaudhary and I am working as an assistant professor at Hansraj College, University of Delhi. I welcome you all. So today, before I begin with the lecture, let me just briefly describe the lecture plan for the day. As you can see, these are the topics that I will be touching on. The very first is K Narayan, where I will be giving an introduction to K Narayan, the author. Then on Indian English literature and the Indian English novel, I will be touching on them briefly. Then I will be also talking about some features of K Narayan's novels and particularly keeping in mind Swami and Friends and also his narrative techniques. And I will be keeping in mind the current novel that we have taken up for analysis, and that is Swami and Friends, his debut novel. Then as you can see, I will also be talking about the introduction to the novel Swami and Friends, then summary of Swami and Friends, then I will be briefly touching on Malgudi. Perhaps how can anyone forget about Malgudi? K Narayan's creation, his town, his imaginary town, so I will be doing that as well. And lastly, the adaptation of the novel in the form of Doordarshan television series that we have. So I will be touching on that as well. So let us begin now with K Narayan's introduction, to the author. Now, Rasipuram Krishnaswamy Iyer Narayan, that's the full name, K Narayan, an Indian literary giant who has been credited, I would say, with establishing the genre of Indian English novel and bringing it to the stage, to the larger audience, and introducing Indian sensibility to the whole world. So such an author needs no detailed introduction to the literary world. His literary output, as we know, was huge. He wrote more than a dozen novels, several volumes of short stories, and also he wrote non-fiction, he wrote essays and autobiographical pieces. His career spanned a period of nearly almost 50 to 60 years. That's a very huge period for any particular author, and he was active for almost 50 to 60 years. He was critically acclaimed, of course. He was honored nationally and internationally both. In 1958, in fact, he even won the Sahitya Akademi Award for The Guide which was later also turned into a movie. In 1964 it was published, right? And in 1964 he received the Padma Bhushan award as well, right? So in 2000, in fact, he was awarded India's second highest civilian honor. He was given the Padma Vibhushan by the government of India, right? His novels and short stories were also televised and also adapted for movies and even made into a TV series. We will be talking about that briefly. Okay. So again, Narayan is considered as one of the pioneers of what I would say the regional novel in India. So the backdrop of nearly all his fiction, briefly just a while ago I was talking about Malgudi, an imaginative town. So nearly all of his fiction is set in Malgudi, almost all of his fiction. Some of his, the autobiographical works, I mean including Swami and Friends, the novel that we will be taking up today, that is also semi-autobiographical, and we will be discussing on that theme as well in the subsequent lectures. But in this lecture, I will be taking up Swami and Friends, right. So K Narayan, you can say, captures the essence of the Indian tradition and the Indian culture and the Indian parents in Swami and Friends. So we'll understand about that as the novel progresses, but he captures the essence of Indian tradition and Indianness very effectively. It is also, Swami and Friends is one of the earliest Indian English novels where you can get a glimpse of India, a glimpse of the Indian families, Indian culture as well. One of the earliest novels where we get the glimpse of the Indian culture, the Indian family, and what actually Indian life actually is, right. So we'll read all of this when we continue with the novel Swami and Friends. But before we actually begin with the novel, let me first briefly take you to the journey of the Indian English novel. How did the Indian English novel emerge? What factors led to the development of the Indian English novel? So very briefly, I will be taking up that. So Indian English literature and Indian English novel, this is going to be my detailed discussion now. So first of all, we will talk about the pre-independence period. Of course, the history of the colonial encounter with the British is categorically important for any reading of the history of Indian literatures in English, right, because we know the English came to India around 1660, with the restoration of monarchy with Charles II in England, way back in England, and it was he who sanctioned the East India Company with powers to exercise jurisdiction over English factories in India, and this is how it all began. They came as a trading company, as we know, and gradually over the next 100 years, by 1757, they started gaining more control over India. We know the Battle of Plassey and how the British started to rule Bengal and then finally India. So another factor, of the rise of the Indian novel in English or Indian English literature was Macaulay's famous Minute to Education, as we all know, published in 1835. Now, his famous Minute to Education, it urged that it was necessary, and he said that it's possible, and I am quoting, to make natives of this country good English scholars, and that to this end our efforts ought to be directed. Right. So clearly Macaulay's, it's Macaulay's, it was his aim to do something very similar on these lines, and the earliest Indian English novels were more or less cast in the form of imitations, and they were the earliest Indian English novels in the 19th century, right. But the form, the content, the style of writing was a mimicry, I would say, of the British literary tradition, the earliest, right. However, on the contrary, the early 20th century, when we come towards Narayan, the earlier 20th century witnessed what you can call this surge of Indianness in terms of form, in terms of content, in terms of style of writing as well, right. So it, and if you can figure out, this also parallels the simultaneous process of the rise of nationalism during the 1910s, the first decade of the 20th century, during the 1920s, 1930s, right. And K Narayan, Swami and Friends, as we know, was published in 1935, and it belongs to this particular era. So embracing the English language was also one feature, of Narayan. He does not apologize for using English. Instead, he embraces English as a medium for his storytelling. He expresses that he was never conscious of using a foreign language. He is simply very comfortable with that, right. It indicates a natural and a very comfortable relation with the language English, right. Of course, the candid presentation, then when we talk about the way in which Narayan writes, unlike other writers who may express anxiety about using a foreign language, Narayan presents his linguistic choices very candidly. He positions himself as a custodian of the English language, suggesting that it can be redefined, repurposed to reflect Indian experiences and narratives, and this point is exactly what he does in Swami and Friends. His use of English is, it's not merely a personal choice that is deeply embedded in the cultural and political context of pre-independence India. It's not just a personal choice, but his narrative reflects a resistance also to the colonial master narrative. So even if Narayan does not adopt an overtly militant stance against the Britishers, his narrative does reflect a resistance to the colonial narrative, and we will see that in the critique of education that Narayan offers in Swami and Friends. We will see that in the character of Mr. Ebenezer when we will go to the novel in the subsequent lectures, right. Because whenever we are studying literature, we are not just studying literature in the sense of just reading its summary, we have to understand the social background as well. So K Narayan, Swami and Friends belongs to this era which parallels the process of the rise of nationalism. So they are parallel to each other, right. And this time, it was this time during the 1920s, 1930s, or perhaps you can simply conclude in the beginning of the 20th century, that there was a surge of nationalism and Indianness in terms of form, in terms of content and the style of writing, as I have mentioned again, right. So along with the rise of the Indian novel in English comes a rise of the Indianness in literature, I would say that, and Narayan is at the helm, right. This is because, and why do I make such a claim? Because the language is foreign, but the historical, social, literary output is purely Indian, isn't it? So therefore Swami and Friends is written in a foreign language, but the literary output, the historical, the social context in it is purely Indian. Now, after this brief introduction, let me go to the features of K Narayan's novels and the various narrative techniques that he has used. Now, some features of K Narayan's works, I will be discussing that, and all these features that I will be describing now are written keeping in mind the novel Swami and Friends. Let us talk first, maybe the novel, Narayan's novel displays his comic vision of life, where his characters show a journey towards experience from innocence. This is very important in the context of Swami's character in this novel. So, experience from innocence, right. So, the readers will notice that in this novel, Swami also grows mentally. The Swami in the chapter 1 and the Swami in chapter 19, in the last chapter, are visibly different. In Swami's character, several changes take place towards the end. So, therefore, the novel shows the change and the journey from innocence to experience, right? And this is a very important feature about Swami and Friends. Then the language that he uses, it's very simple, as I've mentioned, it's very lucid, but at the same time his command over the language is very remarkable. There have been detractors about K Narayan's novelistic techniques and his simple language, but his language is very remarkable, it's very effective for the population, for the larger people, for the readership, right? The language is again very supple. It may not be a very boisterous, it may not be very adventurous, but the language is very light, it's supple, it's simple, it's lucid, and it's extremely readable, I would say, right? That is where the strength of K Narayan as a popular novelist is. So his novels exhibit notable differences between his early works as well as his later works. So if you compare Swami and Friends to the later works by Narayan, it shows an evolving narrative style, thematic focus, character development. The early novels had a semi-autobiographical tone, such as Swami and Friends, or Bachelor of Arts, which was published, I believe, 2 years later than Swami and Friends in 1937. So both these novels draw heavily from his own experiences as a student, as a child, depicting the life of youth in Malgudi with a semi-autobiographical approach. So these novels focus on the innocence of childhood and the struggles of young adulthood against the backdrop of a changing India. Then the narrative style, again, as I have mentioned, is very straightforward, it is unpretentious, it is characterized by a focus on the ordinary events, on the everyday life. So this simplicity allows readers to connect easily with the characters and their experiences, right? So the complexity is very limited here, right? The themes in the early novels tend to revolve around personal growth, familial relationships, and societal expectations. But at the same time, they also lack deeper philosophical or existential explorations, right? However, as Narayan goes forward, his later novels were much more imaginative and they were much more creative. Beginning with, for example, The English Teacher, published in 1945, Narayan's writing takes on a more imaginative quality, right? He starts to incorporate broader themes, he starts to introduce complex characters, he is moving from strictly autobiographical narratives to explore more universal human experiences. For example, The Guide, which was published in 1958, for example, A Tiger for Malgudi, 1983, which delves into philosophical themes. So there is a philosophical depth in The Guide which makes it a fabulous reading of human soul, human heart, human mind, and human emotions. Perhaps in some other lecture someday I might take up The Guide as well. So themes such as identity, spirituality, and the search for meaning are present in his later works. These novels often reflect a more mature understanding of life's complexities, right? Then the character development. So Narayan's characters exhibit great depth and complexity. They grapple with moral dilemmas, for example, in the character of Swami, societal changes, for example, in the character of Swami, right? And even in other novels, these are some of the similar themes. Similarly, in the case of The Guide, in the character of the famous railway Raju and Rosie, it happens. So then again, the narrative techniques. The next is the narrative techniques. Narayan's later works showcase a refined narrative technique, and he employs various perspectives and a more sophisticated use of irony and humor. So overall, while his early novels are characterized by their simplicity and a focus on the autobiographical element, his later works reveal a shift towards imaginative storytelling, towards philosophical inquiries, towards complex characterization. This shows the growth of a fabulous of a great novelist. It shows the growth of a very receptive, very perceptive novelist, right? But I would say that overall, Narayan's works follows no proper ideology, right? Narayan is not propagating any ideology through his works. Unlike Mulk Raj Anand, his very famous contemporary, he follows no ideology. He is not even a very grand philosopher like perhaps Raja Rao, he is another contemporary. So K Narayan is not there to influence any change in the readers, he is not committed to bringing about a change, right? And here I will show you the quote by K Narayan. He says, "Critics say that I don't talk about the aspirations of the people, of the political agony that we have gone through, and of all those plans for economic growth. I am not interested in any of that. I am interested in human characters and their background." So these are the words by K Narayan himself. He is agreeing to that, right? So through Swami and Friends, he does not propagate any ideology. K Narayan simply describes. He describes the everyday life, he describes the innocence, he describes the fears, the troubles, the fears of a child through a child's lens in Swami and Friends. There are also autobiographical elements, in Swami and Friends, right. So, as I have mentioned, several of his novels draw from, from his own life. Swami and Friends is also full of autobiographical elements of R K Narayan's lives, right. The experiences of Swami's lives are directly taken from his life. So, R K Narayan also, and if you know, as I mentioned, his full name is Rasipuram Krishna Swami Iyer Narayan, Krishna Swami. R K Narayan also has Swami in his name. So, there is a mention of Swami in his name also, which shows us, how he has been employing autobiographical elements as well. So, here I will end this topic, and now let us go forward to the novel. This is the novel R K Narayan, Swami and Friends. I will be taking up the Indian Thought publications, and I am going to read the essay. I am going to read the entire novel from this particular edition, right. So, again, he is, as I mentioned, he is undoubtedly one of the greatest Indian writers, and he is a writer of the middle class characters of Malgudi, a place of his imagination in South India. Swami and Friends, the novel, is considered the first in the trilogy of Malgudi, coming of age novels, which was published in 1935, and it was largely autobiographical, as I have mentioned, right. So, although the stories are so common that anyone could relate to the protagonist Swami and all of his friends and the incidents going on in their lives. So, at the outset, Swami and Friends can be said to be like an episodic story of schoolboys and their psychology and their tribulations and happiness. Swami and Friends represents the triumph of life, okay. So, this novel celebrates life and fun in life. It is a comic novel, and the novel celebrates life as in general. Psychology of a school going child is also very aptly analyzed by R K Narayan, right. He studies it with a detached objectivity, which is very ironic, which is very funny. At the same time, it is very interesting, right. Most of the characters in this novel are flat characters, but one thing is constant, that is innocence. Innocence is exemplified through a comic, ironic view. So, R K Narayan understands the psyche, the inner being, the true being of a child, the psychology of a child. He understands the workings of a child. He is interested, as he has already mentioned, in human behavior, human inconsistencies. So, he understands this in a very wonderful manner, and he is interested in human relationship. This is one of the main points that we have to understand while we read R K Narayan, right. So, it is to show the happy world of children, to show the different shades of a child's life, right, their families, their friendships, their education, their fights, their bickerings, and so on and so forth. So, it perfectly fits into the category of children's literature, I can also say that. Let us go now to the summary of Swami and Friends. So, here I will be taking up the summary part by part. There are total 19 chapters in this novel, and I will be reading the summary of each chapter and will explain the major points which are important to understand the larger plot, right. So, this is chapter number 1. Chapter number 1 is titled Monday Morning. So, the novel opens with Swami getting up from bed on a Monday morning to get ready for his school. The distaste for any young student who does not want to go to the school is shown in the very opening pages of the novel. Narayan is showing the feeling of Monday blues that Swaminathan is going through, thinking about that dismal yellow school building and the strict school teachers, right. Then Narayan goes on to describe the various class periods of his school and the various teachers who took the classes of Swami. Mr. Vedanayagam is a teacher who is described as fire-eyed because he is very strict. Then there is another teacher, Mr. D. Pillai, who is described as a kind teacher. He is humorous, he is a brilliant teacher. Then comes Mr. Ebenezer, the scripture teacher. He disrespects Indian gods and he prefers the Bible, he praises Christian gods, and he prefers the Bible over Bhagavad Gita, and he speaks badly about the Indian scriptures and religion. Upon seeing this, Swaminathan revolts against this in the class, and Mr. Ebenezer in anger twists the ears of Swami. The next day, Swami brings a letter from his father regarding this incident to the headmaster. Then the 4 friends of Swami were also described in this chapter. First is Somu, the class monitor, who was a favorite of the teacher. Then second is Mani, who is described as the mighty good for nothing. He was a tall boy and no one dared fight against him. Even the teachers did not trouble him, and he was believed to be very strong. He was a bully. He bullied everyone in the class. He failed in several classes and was very poor in academics. Then the third friend is Sankar, the class topper who always used to score more than 90% marks in all his subjects. Then you have the fourth friend. His name is Samuel, or P, who was also called a P mutter owing to his short stature and was just an ordinary student of the class, right. So, chapter 1 ends here with the headmaster asking Swaminathan to resolve issues with him and not complain to his father, and rather that he should try to solve issues related to the school in the school itself. Then comes the second chapter, and the name of this chapter is Rajam and Money. Now, chapter 2 introduced a new character. His name is Rajam. He was a son of the superintendent of police who belonged to an influential family. He was nicely dressed. He looked like a European to the whole class. Rajam was very good with English. He impressed everyone in the class with his personality. And he was perhaps the only one who was not bullied by Money. Money was a class bully, as I have mentioned, but he was not able to dominate Rajam. In a funny series of events, the two even decide to meet near the river and fight out amongst themselves. Rajam brought his gun and Money brought his club. And then again, in a very funny and innocent sequence of events, the two very soon become friends and forget their enmities, and K Narayan is showing the innocence of childhood and how children, they fight on small things and they make amends even more quickly. So, chapter 2, it ends here. Let us go now to the next chapter, and the name of the chapter is Swami's grandmother. Now, chapter 3 describes Swami's grandmother and also describes the conversation between the two. And she is a simple old woman and a companion of Swami who listens to all his stories. Then on weekends, Swami goes to Rajam's house along with Money, where they have a fun time. So, that is it about chapter 3. Now, the next chapter is chapter number 4. This is What is a Tale. Now, the next chapter describes a shocking event in Swami's life which troubles him greatly. Somu, Shankar and Samuel make fun of Swami by calling him Rajam's tail. They trouble him and call him names, as Swami is a very close friend of Rajam. They tease him by calling him Rajam's tail. This chapter shows the changing dynamics of the friends with each other, and Swami is greatly disturbed in this new change. The friendship appears to be broken here, right? So, here chapter 4 ends. Next is chapter number 5, and the name of this chapter is Father's Room. Swami has invited Rajam to his own house. He goes to inform his grandmother that while Rajam is there, she should not call him. Then he goes to his father to ask for his room. And why does he do all this? He does this because he wants to impress Rajam, and that he wants to show him that he has a very well furnished room, that he has his own room to his own self, even though he does not, right? Then after a few days, when Swaminathan comes to the class, he finds that on the blackboard it was written tail, T-A-I-L, in huge bold capital letters. Then all of a sudden, enraged by this, Swaminathan goes and slaps both Samuel and Shankar, and the three children end up fighting with each other. And then finally, chapter 5 ends here. Next is chapter number 6. As you can see, it is a friend in need. Now, this chapter takes us a few weeks later to Rajam's house. Rajam brings everyone to his house and gives them a lecture on friendship. So, we see the character of Rajam. We will come to the character analysis later on, but we see how Rajam is trying to make amends, make everyone friends again. Right? Then he narrates them a few anecdotes from the Vedas, from the scriptures, and informs them that they will be severely punished in hell if they harbor enmity against each other, against their friends. So, he is lecturing them on friendship, right? Thirdly, when both these ideas become ineffective, he offers them toys and gifts from his huge collection. As we know, Rajam belongs to a very affluent family. He is the son of the superintendent of police, and this, and when he offers them all of his toys, this makes the entire group forget their enmity, and due to Rajam's sweet and innocent efforts, once again friendship gets restored between all these characters who were earlier fighting on in the previous chapter. Then the next chapter is a new arrival. Now, in this chapter, the new arrival is the younger brother of Swami who is born. It is a very short chapter which simply describes this event, that a younger brother of Swami is born. And next up is chapter number 8. This is the name of the chapter, Before the Examinations. So, as we know, examinations are coming close. The students are tense, trying to cover their syllabus in the last minute right before the exams. So, this is a very funny chapter, this particular chapter, and the incidents described in this chapter are extremely funny. They show the innocence, they show the tribulations, they show perhaps any reader would find their own situation in this particular chapter, because even all of us during our childhood, we have been troubled by the idea of examinations. Then for instance Swaminathan, he was troubled by the thought that if he does not study, then his friends will go up in the class and he will fail in his class, he will have to repeat the class. Due to this fear, he finally agrees to study, but only for half an hour, right? So, we see how children are also innocent. They are they do something, then they forget it, and the innocence of children, that is what K Narayan is showing, right? Then Money also goes to the clerk What Mani does is he goes to the clerk, because Mani has been a repeated, he repeatedly has failed in his class. He goes to the clerk for asking question papers, and he gives him a bribe of brinjals. Yes, he gives him a bribe of brinjals. This chapter also shows the colonial education and how it is creating a bad effect on these children. So chapter 8 ends here. The next chapter is, as you can see, it's school breaks up. In this chapter, we get to see the kind of questions that are asked in the examination. Both chapter 8 and chapter 9, they offer a critique of the education system of the colonial period. It shows the poor state of education, where the length of the answers is more important than the content of it. Right? So chapter 9 ends with the summer vacation. The ending of this chapter shows the jubilant mood, the life, the energy of the school children, who are very happy with the advent of the summer vacations. The mood is jovial and everyone is happy. Let's come to the next chapter, and that is chapter number 10, Coachman's Son. In this chapter, Swaminathan all of a sudden wants to have a cartwheel, a hoop. His one consuming passion in life was now to get a wheel. So we see how passions change for children very soon, and in just 3 more chapters we will see the next passion of Swami's life will be cricket. Right? So he goes to the coachman, he takes the money but refuses to give the wheel to Swaminathan. Then both Mani and Swami talk to the coachman's son, who in turn throws stones at him and unleashes the street dogs on him. And all the adventures ended in a very ugly manner. So this is the end of chapter number 10. I will end the lecture here. I will see you in the next part with the remaining summaries from chapter number 11 till chapter number 19. Thank you so much for your attention. I'll see you very soon. Thank you.